it's happened before, John. This kind of attack, after discussions with Trump on the phone with Putin, got Trump's attention and made him realize, this is now we're talking about a month ago, month and a half ago, made Trump realize at that time that Putin is not serious. Is not serious about peace.
The latest Russian airstrikes on Kyiv were appalling, as they always are. At least 19 people killed this time, including 4 children. The EU described the attack as evidence Vladimir Putin and his forces are mocking hopes of peace through negotiation. And who can seriously dispute that that is the case? The hope among Ukraine's friends is this latest outrage may persuade President Trump to rethink his watch-and-wait approach to toughening sanctions against Russia. But is there any real chance of that? Meanwhile, Russia's ambassador to the UK was summoned to the Foreign Office here in London after the Russian strikes damaged the British Council building in Kyiv. An EU building was also hit. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen condemned the attack.
I'm outraged by the attack on Kyiv, also hitting our EU offices. This was the deadliest drone and missile attack on the capital since July. And this is another grim reminder of what is at stake. It shows that the Kremlin will stop at nothing to terrorize Ukraine, blindly killing civilians, men, women and children, and even targeting the European Union. This is why we are keeping maximum pressure on Russia.
Now, earlier, I spoke to Arseniy Yatsenuk, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, and he told us how he felt the West should deal with Putin.
We are out of time. We are not allowed to grant any kind of immunity and impunity for Putin. We are not allowed to grant him another weeks, months, or even years. Because Putin strongly believes that he can even get years of this. Putin doesn't care about words. He cares about actions. It is high time. It is really high time to act.
Arseniy Yatsenuk there. And I've been joined here in the studio by Matthew Luxmore, the Wall Street Journal correspondent who covers Ukraine and Russia. Good to see you here, Matthew.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. So again, another show of solidarity by Ukraine's friend across Europe. I mean, we saw them flocking to the White House just a few days ago, and now we have protests from across Europe. We have the Brussels calling this a mockery of peace hopes, and the British government have called in the Russian ambassador. So plenty of solidarity. But the big question, as always, is what difference is it going to make?
Yeah, I mean, there's, of course, been solidarity throughout the war, right? No shortage of that. But this attack is nothing new, I think, compared to what we've had over the last 3.5 years. This is a particularly deadly one, actually. 19 people dead, as you mentioned, in Kiev, and the deadliest strike since Trump met Putin in person in Alaska. Yeah, I mean, whether it leads to anything, this solidarity, I'm not convinced. Of course, Trump is trying quite hard to strike a peace deal, but the most important thing, and actually, if you listen to what the Russians are saying, it's quite clear. I mean, their position really hasn't changed. So, you know, there's a lot of talk about security guarantees and peacekeeping forces in Ukraine and all those kinds of things. But Russia has actually made clear for the last 3.5 years that this is simply a red line for them. So there's a lot of hypothetical discussions right now. But of course, the strike today just highlights to people that Russia's, not interested in peace in this war.
I'm absolutely uninterested. I want to get your thoughts on President Trump in just a second, as you would expect. But just a word more on the European friends of Ukraine, because there is a singularity of purpose. They want to stand by Ukraine as far as that's possible. There is at least, I don't know how much comfort can be taken from this, but there is at least no sign of war weariness on the part of the European friends of Ukraine. I mean, there was some talk, and you'll have heard it more clearly than me over the months and over the years of the European allies of Ukraine losing their will to stand where they stand. That hasn't happened, at least.
Well, I think you have to say that Trump's push to get some kind of peace in Ukraine, however flawed it's been, has kind of energized Europe once again. I mean, we had this incredible spectacle of all the European leaders, several of them flocking to the White House.
For fear of Donald Trump giving ground.
Right, exactly, but also in solidarity with Zelensky, who was in a real spat with Trump the last time he visited the Oval Office. And this was really kind of something unprecedented almost, right? It really kind of did show that they are in solidarity with Zelensky and with Ukraine. And I think that, the Europeans have skin in the game. This is much more important for them than to the US, to American citizens, because this war is right on the border with Europe. But I think that they're kind of proceeding from this assumption that Russia's position can be swayed. Whether it's by Trump's force of personality and his meetings with Putin, which has clearly not been the case.
Yes.
Or by massive sanctions against Russia, which I think is also, we've seen over the last 3.5 years of war, and of course there can be more sanctions, but that has not swayed Russia's position. Yes. Russia says the same things it's been saying for the last 3.5 years. And I do think that the Russians are probably kind of, in some ways, a bit amused by this continual expectation that they will somehow agree to peacekeeping forces when you have to give them to them. One thing they have been is very consistent in their position, and however terrible that that position is, it really hasn't shifted.
And the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer today, in his reaction to the attacks in Kyiv, is again making clear he does not take the hope of Putin suddenly seeing the dove of peace spread its wings in his breast. That he knows that's not going to happen. But if those European friends of Ukraine do not invest some hope in Donald Trump putting his shoulder to the wheel and adding to the pressure on Putin, what else are they to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And as far as ending this war, this does seem to be the kind of avenue or the route that they're going down, which probably has the largest probability of success, which does not say that it has a large probability of success of actually ending the war. But it has moved the needle forward. I mean, Putin met with Trump. We don't know exactly what Putin said, because there seemed to be a huge amount of misunderstanding about what was actually said, with Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff apparently misunderstanding what the Russians said to him. So
could have been not understanding the Russian language
exactly at all. Presumably, it was being translated to English.
Not very well, though. Apparently.
No, apparently not. So we're not quite clear what concessions, if any, Russia has made since the start of this war, and it doesn't seem that Putin has made any. So I don't know. Obviously there is this big diplomatic push right now, but I think the really big question that we should probably be focused on mainly is whether Trump will impose sanctions on Russia, because that is probably the one new thing that could happen right now that might sway the Russians in some ways, because so far that hasn't happened.
Okay, Matthew Luxmore from the Wall Street Journal. Great to talk to you as always.
Thanks very much.
Now, let us get the thoughts of William B. Taylor, who is a former American ambassador who has served in Ukraine during President Trump's first term. Welcome to the show, Ambassador.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Do you believe, is there any part of you that believes that this latest attack on Kyiv could be some kind of game changer where President Trump is concerned? I know you have to be skeptical about this, but what are your thoughts?
So it's happened before, John. This kind of attack, after discussions with Trump on the phone with Putin, got Trump's attention and made him realize, this is now, we're talking about a month and a half ago, made Trump realize at that time that Putin is not serious. He's not serious about peace. He's not serious when he's on the phone with President Trump. And that could lead, in answer to your question, that could, again, force President Trump to the conclusion that no matter what he would like, Putin is not his friend. Putin is not interested in peace. Putin indeed is the enemy, is the obstacle to what President Trump has been trying to do, to his credit, trying to stop the war, stop the killing.
Yes, which is a conclusion you'd imagine, Ambassador, would be screaming the obvious to almost anyone who looks at the situation today.
It is screamingly obvious. However, it takes something to get through. And as I say, it got through before. This attack could get through again. The attack on the American firm, but what seems to really bother President Trump, as it should us all, is our attacks on civilians and on children. And this has gotten to him before. This could get it again.
I wonder if it's the case, Ambassador, and maybe not an unreasonable speculation, that who the reports and the sight of children suffering, children dying in Ukraine, really gets through to is Melania Trump, the First Lady. In fact, President Trump has made that fact pretty clear out loud, openly in public. And that could, extraordinarily, be a significant factor, couldn't it?
It could well be. You're exactly right. President Trump tells a story that after one of his phone calls with President Putin, he comes back into the residence and says to his wife, well, I had a good conversation with President Putin today. And she says, oh, really? well, the Russians just attacked another Ukrainian city, and that was Trump's description of what happened, and for that, Melania is a hero, as you know, John, in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians recognize that she may well have that effect on President Trump.
I mean, again, speculating, but what else can one do? The president and Melania are going to be here in a couple of weeks' time here in Britain on a state visit. They'll be meeting the king. There will be state banquets and bands. Maybe a smart move. Maybe you'd be advising this if you were given the opportunity. Maybe during that visit to Windsor, someone should take Melania Trump aside. Maybe the Queen, maybe the Princess of Wales. You can see where my mind is working. Maybe that makes sense.
Does make sense, John. Does make sense. Any and all avenues. And I think it's ripe, as I say. I think President Trump was there before. Then he had this conversation in Anchorage that turned Trump around away from a ceasefire, which he went into guns ablazing, trying to get a ceasefire. And he came out of that meeting in Anchorage with President Putin, having been convinced that a ceasefire was not the right way to go. So he can be influenced either way, and certainly what you have in mind is a possibility.
And I raise all these possibilities more in hope than expectation. I mean, if I offered you, Ambassador, a bet that in the president's response to these latest outrages, he tells us that he'll make a final judgment on this in 2 weeks' time, would you take that bet?
So he has made this. He's made this commitment several times, John, as you say. It's another 2 weeks. But there are a couple of things that your conversation with Matthew struck me, and that is these sanctions. Yes, they've not had the effect that we all wanted before, but I think the sanctions that Trump put on India for buying Russian oil, he actually did it. He pulled the trigger on those sanctions, those tariffs, those secondary tariffs, and that got Putin's attention to the degree that I think that was what moved Putin to try to get that meeting, to avoid further tariffs. So I do believe that has power, and that Trump could use that, and that he will figure that out.
Yes, I mean, I think it's the case. I mean, India is the second biggest buyer of Russian oil. Of course, if the president...
So the Financial Times says they're the first biggest buyer. So they're among the top two, no doubt.
Right. I mean, China then is the other big one. And if the same squeeze was put on China, that really would make a difference, one would imagine. Again, that's a little harder to see.
It is, but again, I do believe that Putin panicked when he saw that. The other question that you and Matthew talked about is whether or not the Russians would ever agree to a security guarantee. That's not relevant. The Russians don't get a say in that security guarantee. That security guarantee is between Ukraine and the Europeans and the Americans, and no one should be asking the Russians if they want Ukraine to have a security guarantee to keep them from invading again. That makes
and yet, Ambassador J.D. Vance, the Vice President, said it was legitimate to say that Russia had an interest in Ukraine's future security. The opposite of what you're saying.
No, it's not quite the opposite, but you're right. There's a tension there. There's no doubt. Russia has its own view of its own security. That's fine. Ukraine has its own view of its security. That's also fine. Ukraine's a sovereign nation. It can make agreements with whoever they want. That's the important thing, that they make the arrangements, security arrangements, economic arrangements with the Europeans and the Americans without the Russian oversight.
Right. Now, all those of us who care about the future of Ukraine will hope for a change in the wind in Washington. But again, a little bit hard to not to be discouraged when you see President Trump, as he did a couple of days ago in the Oval Office, showing off a picture of him standing alongside Vladimir Putin and telling everyone that he was about to sign it and send it to him, as if he was his closest friend. Hard not to be a bit discouraged by that.
Hard not to be outraged by that. And the Ukrainians are outraged by that, as well as the treatment that President Trump gave to President Putin in Anchorage. Putin, for Ukrainians, is the face of evil. He's responsible for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian deaths. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian families have buried family members. They hate him. And to see Putin received in Anchorage was too much to take.
All right. William B. Taylor, former U.S. ambassador with service in Ukraine under Donald Trump's first term under his belt. Great to talk to you, Ambassador. Thank you.